Good evening or morning to those in Hong Kong, and thank you all for joining us. I am Sebastian Burka, the Associate Director of the Stigler Center, and today we are happy to host Professors Richard Wong and Geoffrey Stone for the fifth webinar in our series, Freedom of Speech, Hong Kong and the Future of US-China Relations. The series was created to facilitate conversations among leading scholars and experts about the implications of the ongoing events in Hong Kong for freedom of speech, US-China relations, and beyond. Before we begin, please note that we are on the record and we will post the event video on our YouTube channel later. If you have questions for the speakers, we will address them in the last 15 minutes or so, and you can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And we hope that you will join us for more upcoming webinars on the Hong Kong topic and others. So please check our website, our publication, promarket.org, and our Capitalism podcast, hosted by Luigi Zingales and Bethany McLean. Back to today, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. YC Richard Wong is the Provost and Deputy Vice Chancellor, the Director of the Hong Kong Institute of Economics and Business Strategy, and the Philip Wong Kennedy Wong Professor in Political Economy at the University of Hong Kong. He is also a University of Chicago alum. Geoffrey Stone is the Edward H. Levi Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, and he is also a Chicago Law School alum and has served in many distinguished positions, including as University Provost. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, it's great to see you. We look forward to having a lively conversation in which we will have an opportunity, I think, to explore some of the fundamental questions that have arisen in Hong Kong with China with the national security law. So Richard will begin by talking a bit to lay the foundation for the discussion and give some context and history. And then we'll have some questions. And then, as we said, we'll open it up to the audience for questions later. So Richard, why don't you take over?
Thank you, Jeff. I think it's useful to understand the constitutional background to the current national security law legislation that was enacted by Beijing. First of all, prior to 1997, Hong Kong was a British colony with a high degree of economic and civil liberties, but we did not have political democracy. What the basic law did was under the Sino-British joint declaration was to promise that Hong Kong would have a high degree of autonomy. And the basic law basically gave effect to the political arrangements as well as the economic and civil liberties arrangement. Within the basic law, I would like to make three aspects. First of all, the basic law has an Article 23, which basically stipulated that the Hong Kong legislature should pass a national security law to safeguard national security issues in the territory of Hong Kong that will defend and protect China's national security. That law, however, was never enacted in Hong Kong. The first attempt to do that, and the only attempt, was in 2003, and it failed after a very massive peaceful protests. Since then, that Article 23, which is about the national security law, has never been attempted to put forward. This represents an unsatisfactory situation for the Chinese government, as Hong Kong failing to uphold its constitutional obligations. The second aspect emerged, what that was important, is that in giving effect to the basic law, Beijing agreed that Hong Kong would have a universally elected legislature over time by stages, and also a chief executive that would be universally, that would be elected through universal suffrage. This too was to happen in stages. Um, Beijing also agreed that this will the chief executive to be returned through universal suffrage will begin in around 2012. It happened. To 2012. Yes, but the proposal that Beijing came forward was derailed and was not adopted by the legislature. And prior to that, we had a protest movement, which has since been dubbed the Yellow Umbrella Movement, or the Occupy Central Movement. Um, so from Beijing's point of view, they had done their duty to provide universal suffrage to return the chief executive, and the Hong Kong legislature did not adopt it. Following that, last year in 2019, the Hong Kong chief executive introduced an extradition bill that would allow criminals, alleged criminals, to be extradited to take place between Hong Kong and Taiwan, between Hong Kong and mainland. This sparked off massive protest, even when the Hong Kong government, the chief executive, finally agreed to withdraw the proposal. The protest movement turned to a demand for democracy, and it also turned very violent. And it lasted for over 6 months and was only stopped when COVID-19, the pandemic, broke out. And during that period, this June, Beijing government enacted a national security law, which basically targeted a subset of issues that would have been included under Article 23. Article 23 is to have laws that would prohibit any act of treason, secession, sedition, subversion against the central people's government, or theft of state secrets, to prohibit foreign political organizations or bodies that conduct political activities in the region, and to prohibit political organizations or bodies of the region from establishing ties with foreign political organizations or bodies. That is Article 23. We haven't enacted that. The national security law fills part of the gap and specifically covers only 4 elements, which is secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion, but does not cover areas of treason, sedition, and theft of state secrets. The Beijing basically expects Hong Kong to do the rest of the Article 23. The national security law, no doubt, will limit the exercise of political freedom. Specifically, from Beijing's point of view, the violence and the political acts of the protesters, as well as legislators and councillors, have threatens China's sovereignty, particularly when some of the elements of the movement are sought to declare independence of Hong Kong. It's important to realize that during the final British negotiations prior to 1997, Beijing had refused the British government's proposal that the negotiation on the future of Hong Kong should be a tripartite arrangement. That is, between the Beijing government, the British government, and the people of Hong Kong would have a representative. This is called the 3-legged stool. Beijing insisted that it would only be a negotiation between the British and Chinese governments, to which the people of Hong Kong should not participate. In other words, by implication, sovereignty and independence of Hong Kong was completely ruled out, that the people of Hong Kong would not have a say on their political future. But it was agreed that for the affairs internal to Hong Kong, the people of Hong Kong could have a fairly direct political freedom to participate in the affairs of Hong Kong, but not over the issue of sovereignty. And the protests, certainly leading up to last year, was deemed by Beijing to threaten those issues. It is important to notice that in Hong Kong, even by the 1980s, there was a democratic movement, which I will call the old democratic movement. The old democratic movement sought to create a more open political system, empowering people of Hong Kong with more political liberties, but there was never an attempt in the old democratic movement to assert that they were not Chinese. They wanted a separate identity, in particular a nativist or national identity. And the old democratic movement also supported the democratic dissenting movements in China. Beginning around 2008, among the young population, particularly among students, including high school students, a nativist movement emerged. That in which identity of the young became nativist and more think of themselves as Hong Kongers as opposed to being Chinese. I personally think the rise of social media had something to do with this. The other thing was around the same time after 2003, because after economic crises, Hong Kong decided to open up its borders to mainland visitors. Today, with a population of 7.5 million in Hong Kong, we have annually 6.6 million mainland visitors who come to the city. And for many people, this created nuisance and inconvenience, even though they bring consumer demand to our borders to contribute to the economy. So a sense of being occupied and invaded grew after 2008. After China's opening in 1978, Hong Kong's borders were closed to the mainland except for about 150 migrants from the mainland could settle in Hong Kong. This basically amounted to, over the years, that over 2.3 million people from the mainland had become permanent residents of Hong Kong in a population of 7.5 million. So there is intense interaction, perhaps sometimes not so pleasant interactions with the mainland visitors, and to a lesser degree, I think, settlers, permanent settlers that had helped fuel nativist sentiments. In addition, the real incomes in Hong Kong for the majority of the population have been stagnant or even declining. So there are a mixture of economic and social factors that have fueled the rise of a nativist identity. And all this is perceived as being a threat to China's exercise of sovereignty over Hong Kong. So you have a national security law, and I think it will therefore place limits and constraints over the expression of political freedom, specifically the type that would be nativist and pro-independence. So that's what I would like to give in terms of a background.
That's terrific. That's really terrific. So one thing I'm curious about is I gather that the polls have showed that a substantial majority of the residents of Hong Kong are opposed to the national security law. Is that true?
Yes, because it is perceived as inevitably a constraint against the expression of political freedoms. But again, Hong Kong society is divided. It is divided in the following sense. First, the old Democrats and the young nativists are uneasy political partners. They do not share the same vision. They both would like to have a more open political society, but as I mentioned, they are uneasy partners, and on many issues, they completely disagree with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as a result of it, the young nativist movement is much more keen to exercise violence in its expression for its political liberties, and that is uncomfortable to the old Democrats. But they are united in their concerns about Beijing. However, there are also significant portions of Hong Kong society who has become absolutely abhorred by the violence that were displayed in the 6 months in the 2019 last year. That there is also a strong yearning for a return to normalcy, political stability. I guess it's sort of a Hobbesian-like interest in maintaining peace and stability, that the divisiveness for many years, political liberty has manifested in gridlock in the legislature. Where filibuster could prevent anything from being decided for half a year. You couldn't even elect a bills committee chairman. So there are also significant portions of society who see that there are many important economic and social legislation that are being held up because of political bickering. So it is a divided community politically.
How will the national security law be implemented in Hong Kong's common law legal system?
Well, I think because China is on a civil law system, so it has promulgated the national security law, which the basic law does provide a framework for laws that are enacted by national security, like the national security law by the Beijing National People's Congress Standing Committee, to become adopted as part of Hong Kong's basic law. But the national security law is generally quite vague and imprecise, unlike what civil law statutes normally would be, right? Unlike it. And that, I think, is partly to allow the common law tradition in Hong Kong and the system to operate. So whereas it lays out the general principles, the specific interpretation in application is left to a number of different parties. First, the enforcement agency, which would mean the police, would need specific guidelines to whom they will arrest. The Secretary of Justice, which is the equivalent of the Attorney General's office in the United States, will have to decide how to prosecute. And then the courts would then independently adjudicate. So the precise application and interpretation of those general principles in the national security law, they cover, secession and so forth. Those issues would only be concretely manifest as the laws are, as the courts adjudicate. Up to at the present time, over 20 individuals have been arrested under the national security law. Prosecution has not started. Some are on bail and some are not. And no court has yet heard the case yet.
We've had experience in the United States with laws somewhat similar to this, where the terms are vague and where the discretion given ultimately to the prosecutors and to the judges has proven to be extremely broad. And in some instances, like during World War I, for instance, where we had the Espionage Act, which did not specifically talk about prohibiting the press and prohibiting criticism of the government or the war, but those provisions were interpreted extremely broadly by the Department of Justice and then by the courts to basically prohibit any criticism of the government. And so you're right. I mean, the problem with having laws crafted in this way is that it's very easy for prosecutors and courts to interpret them in ways that are not bounded at all. By prohibiting secession can be interpreted as anyone who criticizes the government is encouraging people to support secession, and therefore they can be punished. So you're right. There's a real risk built into the structure of laws that are drafted in this manner.
Well, one of the things is because of the British colonial legacy, prior to 1997, the British colonial government had over the years, particularly inherited from the 19th and early 20th century, enormous armory of laws that would prevent criticism, prevent rioting, public nuisance. So there is no lack of armory in the law. These laws have not been repealed. They are still on the books. And indeed, the chief executive, together with his or her cabinet, the executive council, can always declare a state of emergency. Mm-hmm. And put in place emergency laws or executive orders in dealing with these matters. Indeed, the vast majority of the difference, the real difference that has happened is that even violent protests can be dealt with our existing laws. The national security law essentially gives substance to the content of the political agitation and political act. So far as we can tell in Hong Kong, the police are not apprehending or arresting anyone who is criticizing the government. They are only arresting individuals who are openly calling for or raising political slogans to request for the independence of Hong Kong, right? Criticizing Beijing government officials or Hong Kong government officials or policies has not come under scrutiny of the national security law, but calling for independence has. Well, the courts would yet have to go into action before we know exactly how it will pan out. The stated purpose of the national security law is basically to be a deterrence to the political violence that the acts of violence that appeared in the protests and return a norm of stability. Now, but inevitably, if you prohibit certain expressions of political freedom, which from the perspective of the national security law is agitating for independence is not prohibited. The thing was, prior to the national security law, it was not prohibited, right? And you could only charge a person who advocated independence for disrupting the public, becoming a public nuisance, for pursuing violent acts or conduct protests without permission of the police and so forth. You could, in fact, it's interesting to note that Article 23, which was first proposed by the Hong Kong government in 2003 was basically a collection of all the laws that were in place in the British colonial legacy. And once you compile them together, the people of Hong Kong was abhorred, right? There was nothing new in the law. It just put it together under one article, and then people were, were very worried, and therefore that's why they protested, and eventually it was withdrawn. And so there is no lack of army. It's only that it was disruption of peace, right? Rather than the content of the purpose, right? Now we've added a content to the purpose of your political act, and I think this has been the background for the adoption of the national security law. Of course, it does create many other consequences. So far, we do not see those the national security law has obvious implications for economic and civil liberties.
So one of the things that we've in the United States come to understand over many, many years of building a First Amendment free speech jurisprudence is the reality of chilling effect. That is the concern that ambiguity in the state of the law leads people to be careful and to avoid engaging in activities, buying particular books or newspapers, participating in discussions and saying things that they fear could be used to put them in jail for 10 years, even though it's not clear that that would be the case. But the risk of it can be extremely distorting of public discourse. And you're in the early stages in Hong Kong, obviously, of this phenomenon. But to what extent do you think this is already occurring? To what extent that there are people who are being more cautious about what they say, about what they do politically, because of the concern that such an ambiguous law can be applied and interpreted in ways that would rein in their behavior, even though the law doesn't explicitly prohibit it?
I think this is very early stage, and what I think most people are watching is how do the courts exercise their judgment in individual cases. Surely, because the courts are common law courts and they are open courts, unless the discussion actually involves state secrets, right? But then state secret is not under the national security law as it has been enacted at the moment, right? So it's highly likely that most of these cases, or the vast majority, will be tried in open court, and therefore I think people are waiting to see. Now, does that mean they are hesitating? It's important to notice that although some of the protesters have openly advocated for Hong Kong independence, the advocacy for the interest and commitment to have Hong Kong becoming independent is certainly not shared by the vast majority of the people in Hong Kong. So there is no sympathy for independence as a political course. There is sympathy for a more open society, right? So people are still observing. Now, does that lead to some self-censorship? Not in terms of criticism of political policies, public policies, social policies in Hong Kong, but a bit more cautious about accidentally being interpreted as advocating independence. People might not joke about it, right? At this stage, we're only seeing very little impact on that. Largely because there is no real market for political market for advocating independence of Hong Kong. It is, I think, a nativist movement that is reacting to the economic and social pressures over the past decade. So I do not see at this moment um, enormous self-censorship or, in that sense. How it will develop, we'll see the courts judgment. In any case, you will now of another interest is for the courts of Hong Kong. Uh, uh, National security law is also a new uh, development, right? Courts in Hong Kong throughout its history today, and certainly even under the British colonial rule, the issue of national security cases, I think, has hardly been ever heard in courts. So this is also a new thing for the legal profession, the courts and even the Attorney General's office, right? So there will be a learning curve, I would think, for all
How
this.
autonomous are the courts and the prosecutors in Hong Kong from China? How much are they independent of Chinese influence?
I think the courts are very independent. The court structure in Hong Kong, because as part of the agreement in 1997 in the political transition, the courts are completely independent. And on the Court of Final Appeal, we have foreign judges.
Mm-hmm.
Foreign judges, there are judges that are from Australia, from Britain, from Canada, that sit on the what would be equivalent of high court or judges and that sit on that board to discuss on the court of final appeal. And there is a rotation of foreign judges that sit on the court. So I think the courts are quite independent, but there is a learning curve.
How do you think the national security law will impact schools and citizens' education?
I think it will have an impact because in the national security law, it does provide for that the schools should be explaining the national security law, right? So there will be an education curriculum regarding what the national security law should be. Prior to the enactment of the national security law, the Beijing has always wanted that Hong Kong schools should also have a national education to understand the basic law. From Beijing's point of view, Hong Kong government has failed to explain clearly through its schools what the basic law constitutes. And Beijing thinks that the agitation for independence fails to understand the basic law. The basic law provides that Beijing is committed to having universal suffrage in the election of legislators and chief executive. It does not provide for that Hong Kong should have the right to independence. It does not have a separate sovereignty. And this is and China is like all, shall we say, more modern young nations. Right? China is an old civilization, but it is a modern young nation in the Western nation state sense. It is in a process of building citizenship, loyalty to the state, much as the French after the French Revolution was building citizenship, right? And for it is keen that even the people of Hong Kong must recognize they have a citizen's duty as a Chinese to the state. And from Beijing's point of view, they have given Hong Kong the freedom to have certain rights, including the rights not to bear arms, right? So Chinese residents have no obligations to serve and defend the country in terms of war. So, but then you should have certain duties as citizenship. And I think the national security law will give a stronger push to remind students in schools that they do have a duty as a citizen of the state. So in that sense, I think it will have some impact in terms of now. It is very this is very different from the British colonial days. The significance of the British colonial days was Britain, as the colonial overlord, if you could describe it, had was never interested in making Chinese people loyal to the crown, right? So if anything, the education system was to inculcate neutrality to the subject of citizenship and obligations to the state, and rather to encourage or foster a feeling that you were a universal citizen, as opposed to a citizen of any state. Now that concept, certainly, that push, so the British has no interest, right? Unlike the French colonial masters in Vietnam who wanted to turn Vietnamese to be French citizens, the British had no interest in turning Chinese to become loyal to the crown. And therefore, there is a cultural divide, because most people in Hong Kong have grown up to not feeling naturally loyal to a state, right? And this is one of the issues I think Beijing is feels that Hong Kong has failed in its duties. I think national security law will have some impact on that. So to foreigners, Hong Kong are very familiar, right? They are a citizens of the world, right? But that is very much a British legacy, and I think that part might give some extra impetus to change going forward.
And what about university students? How have they reacted to the enactment of the national security law? Is this something they don't really think much about, or is it something that's caused a good deal of consternation, or what?
Well, students at the university are usually there's always a minority that is very politically active, and that political group are generally apprehensive of national security law. I think the feeling is, of course, not universal across all young people, but most students in the universities have grown up in an environment where they feel very free to exercise their political rights and liberties. So yes, they are certainly concerned about the national security law. That's generally, but most students are like that. I think throughout generations of them, there are usually quite a bit of leaning towards they're natural protesters, if we could say that.
And so are the students actually spending time now talking about this and worrying about it and engaging it in a serious way? It's taking up a lot of their time and energy?
Among the politically active, it's obviously true.
Yes.
And it's important to notice we are also in a different, unusual environment, and that's the pandemic.
Right.
So
of course.
a lot of distancing and gathering. Students are not gathering for these political courses at the moment, but I'm pretty sure there is active discussion in smaller groups.
Right. How will the national security law, do you think, affect Hong Kong's role as an international financial and business center?
I think the national security law itself, as implemented, will have very little implication directly on Hong Kong's role as an international financial center. So one interpretation is precisely but the national security law has triggered considerable rising political tensions and conflict between China and the United States and some of the historical allies of the United States. And the rising geopolitical tensions between US, or shall we more broadly say the West, and China itself may have create economic complexities for what would otherwise have been a very free trade Hong Kong, free financial market Hong Kong. Even this morning, we understand the US government under President Trump has called for the Americans not to buy a list of companies, not to invest in a list of companies from China. Now, all these, so I see the national security law would indirectly contribute to U.S. China and U.S. West China Western tensions, which would indirectly therefore impact trade arrangements, financial center status, and so forth. It could.
Why don't we turn to some questions from the audience at this point? Haresh Sapra asks, do you have a sense if the national security law is already having a chilling effect on academic freedom in Hong Kong?
No, I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. I haven't changed any of my lecture notes. And I do lecture about China being an authoritarian state and so forth. I've never advocated Hong Kong independence, so the national security law does not impact my political convictions at all. As far as I know, the vast majority of professors, in terms of their research and teaching, are not apprehended, but most are waiting to see if how the courts would behave. But in terms of academic freedom, no. Now, so I don't think it is a significant effect on academic freedom as far as we can tell from
now. Rosemary Safranek asks, as a leader of HKU, how are you thinking about the role of the universities in the political situation? How is HKU thinking about how it may have to change in light of the implications of the NSL?
Hello, Rosemary. Thank you for a question. I think I know you. I don't think universities are directly impacted in its normal course of business, but universities would certainly have to watch out for say whether some students would agitate for political courses now deemed explicitly prohibited by the national security law. And those things would be something that we will have to watch out for, because if they occur on campus, then the university is obliged. In the social unrest in the past year, the protest movement got out of control to the extent that many occasions where local Hong Kong students began to apply pressure to students from the mainland who were studying in Hong Kong. And you had no lack of hate speech, abusive behavior that was imposed on the grounds of that they were from, say, the mainland, which basically amounted to behavior that were not civil, and certainly infringe on the freedom of speech of other students and expression of. So these were things that got out of hand on university campuses. They are all on YouTube everywhere. Now, I think the national security law does not directly impact on this. But I think they will have some deterrence on students expressing those views. The university has to watch out and not let this become interfere with the expression of academic freedom or freedom of speech on campus, because social movements for certain political positions sometimes get out of hand in the in the behavior of radicals, extremists, and hate behavior.
So here's a question from someone most of us know. Luigi Zingales asks, where you go? One sec. Here we are. Richard keeps repeating that the national security law is similar to the laws under the British, but the UK was a colonial power. Is China behaving like a colonial power to Hong Kong? If not, what is the difference?
I think what I'm trying to say is the enforcement of laws that prohibit, say, violence, social protests. The British colonial laws have them on the books, but it cannot prosecute them on the account that they were advocating independence. So the national security law differs from the British colonial laws, not in preventing protests and constraining or limiting the acts of violence. It is targeted at the substantive issue of whether you are trying to seek or advocate independence, and also whether such acts are undertaken by seeking the influence of foreign political entities. Now, it's important to notice in Hong Kong does not have legislation governing what constitutes a political party. Political party under Hong Kong, because there is no law, therefore Hong Kong does not have political parties under the law. The self-proclaimed political parties are asserting that they are political parties. There is no, some are constituted through various types of corporate entities, as non-government organizations, as limited liability or associations, right? And as such, there is no legislation governing, say, receiving money from foreign political entities. Right? Because all this is deemed business transactions. So you would have to understand that even after 1997, from Hong Kong does not have formal political organizations. And therefore, nobody can be prosecuted in Hong Kong if they receive, say, funding from a foreign political party or even a secret service agency. You know, there's no law against it. What the national security law allows the Hong Kong legislature to do is to deal with some aspects of this behavior, right? I think it is a deliberate choice on the part of the Hong Kong government and maybe even China that Hong Kong does not have a political party legislation, right? Basically, the intention was that it is fine to have checks and balances to ensure that the government policies, government acts are accountable. But there is to this day, as far as I can tell, under the basic law, there is no intention of allowing Hong Kong by law to develop into a political democracy with competing political parties. That was probably never there in the basic law. And in that sense, what Beijing to a large extent agreed to was a continuity with greater universal suffrage that went beyond the British political set of institutions by allowing people of Hong Kong to elect their legislators and the chief executive, but I don't think they envisage Hong Kong developing into a political system akin to competing political parties that could be elected by the people and therefore be solely accountable to the people of Hong Kong and not the authority.
So you know, we have about 10 minutes left and I think five questions. So Wilbur Chow asks, this past Wednesday, China passed a resolution allowing for the disqualification of any Hong Kong lawmakers who were not deemed, quote, sufficiently loyal. What does this mean for Hong Kong in the interim? What effect does this have in expediting Chinese influence over Hong Kong?
Um, I think it is too early to tell because this just happened, I think, 2 days ago. So, but the consequences is that the four legislators that were disqualified had been disqualified um, uh, a few months ago on account that they had um, uh, thought foreign uh, nations to interfere in Hong Kong's political development. And therefore, they were disqualified to run as a legislator had elections been permitted to go forward in September of this year. As it has, the legislative elections were suspended for a year, and as such, to at least the formal justification would be certainly that the case of a continuation of what would have been the case because they were disqualified to run. Now, does this lead to how would the opposition now move forward? Well, it's a wait and see because the rest of the 15 pan-democratic legislatures have resigned in protest from the legislature. So this is only, I think, the beginning of charting a new course in the political development in Hong Kong under the national security law. What effect it has, I think it is too early to tell. It depends on how the pan-democrats decide to chart their course. And as I mentioned much earlier, there is quite a bit of disagreement between old Democrats and young nativists on the course of action, right? The old Democrats may join the young nativists in finally deciding there is no purpose in contesting power in the legislature. Maybe they will go onto the streets. We do not know. They will have to decide.
Okay, Filippo Lancieri says, Hong has many leading universities and international campuses like Booth. Do you believe that the new law will impact Hong Kong's ability to recruit international students or faculty?
Well, I think not as such. I don't think so. I don't think it will impede. In any case, it is very difficult to tell. At the moment, it is untested because we're in the middle of COVID-19. So nobody is moving in any case from any jurisdiction. So I think time would tell. But I think the impact is not large. What might on the other hand, U.S.-China tensions have led to also many Chinese scholars in the United States wanting to leave wanting to leave the US, and some might find Hong Kong attractive. Now, this does not result in ability to recruit internationally. But so far, this is too early to tell again because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And it has very distorting effects. Intuitively, I think not so, because I don't think academic freedom as such is being threatened on the universities.
Carlos Soto asked, thank you, Professor Wong. Do you see universities in playing any kind of decolonizing role, at least in revisiting the colonial period and noting the type of colonial legacies you mentioned?
Yes, I would imagine that university will study that. Actually, Hong Kong is a bundle of conflicts, right? Before 1997, it also adopted the human rights commitments as part of its. So there are, within the Hong Kong's laws, there are incongruities between commitment to human rights and some of the colonial laws that are also on the books, right? Which I think is an it's absolutely interesting academic subject to study, and of course have enormous practical implications. I think many of my colleagues in the Faculty of Law actually spend a lot of time studying these matters, as many of them are constitutional and human rights lawyers.
Speaking of lawyers and judges, David Ennis asks, what is the process for appointing and removing judges?
Judges are appointed, well, first of all, there's a very long tradition. Judges are appointed first of all, judges are nominated by the Chief Justice, right, through a process that's entirely autonomous. Then they are appointed by the Chief Justice is appointed on the recommendation of the Chief Executive and are considered by the legislature. Other judges are recommended by the Chief Justice and then appointed by the Chief Executive. Once appointed, they are not removed. No, but they do serve terms. They are not for, unlike the Supreme Court, they are not lifetime.
Right. Ana Carolina Pereira Guedes says, hi, my name is Ana Guedes. I am a UChicago Perspective student. And my question for Professor Wong is, what does the acceptance of the national security law by the population of Hong Kong represent for the future of the region in terms of its relationship with mainland China?
Well, I think the immediate impact is quite, because of the COVID-19, Hong Kong is an entirely open economy in its financial markets, in its trading relations, and therefore, what is happening to the world as US-China tensions grow, as pandemic continues, Hong Kong's immediate economic prospects become pretty worrying. On the other hand, given that China's own economy is still recovering, pandemic has subsided in China. There are certainly strong forces that are pulling Hong Kong into greater integration with the Chinese economy. That is probably a very likely outcome. The more US-China conflicts continue, the more Hong Kong is likely to it will maintain its openness, but then most of the economic heavyweight corporations in Hong Kong would likely become more Chinese by sheer size, right? So that is one of the developments. Put the other way around, Hong Kong remains a very useful location to conduct particularly international business, international finance, even for the Chinese economy, Chinese businesses. But Hong Kong may become more Chinese and less international if tensions in the world were to divide into two camps. So yeah.
We have time for one final question from Claudia Rossett. What do you think George Stigler would have said about the national security law for Hong Kong?
I don't know what he would say, but hello, Claudia, another friend I know. But I would think that laws restraining one type of activity would, to a lesser and smaller degree, impact on other types of liberties. It is not entirely possible to separate out different aspects of liberty as a whole, and therefore it might have impact on other forms. It's possible, but I still think it will be a slow process. Hong Kong has always been an anomaly. All kinds of conflicting pressures and tensions pull it in different dimensions. Navigating Hong Kong has always been non-trivial. Hong Kong in the 1950s had a great time surviving because of the United Nations embargo on trade against China as a result of the Korean War. Hong Kong was an entrepot, and if you have a embargo, well, Hong Kong's lifeblood disappeared overnight. We never returned to our trade until a decade, to the same level of trade until a decade later. I think surviving conflicting situations is sort of Hong Kong's forte.
Well, with that, we are out of time and questions. Professor, thank you so much for a really lively and engaging and interesting and informative discussion. And I thank the Stigler Center for inviting us to participate in this. And I wish all of you who are in the audience a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are. And thank you all so much for participating. Richard, be well.
Jeff, nice to be here.
Thank you.